So now we move on to Mary Olson. And through her work as a staff biologist and a political policy analyst at Nuclear Information Resource Service, which many of us know as NIRS, Mary spent decades working for greater health and greater protection for people and communities impacted by nuclear activities. And it was through this work that I first met Mary about almost 20 years ago. She has studied radiation health consequences with some of the leading radiation researchers of the 20th century, Rosalie Bertell, Stuart Caldecott, Wang. She also is featured in an educational film called The Ultimate Wish, Ending the Nuclear Age. After the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in 2011, she decided to pursue questions about greater harm to girls and women from ionizing exposures. From a study of survivors of US nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki compiled over 60 years, she learned there is a measurably greater harm from radiation to girls and women. Mary's briefing paper on the subject has formed the basis of her core work ever since and has led to several speaking engagements worldwide. She has testified all over. Mary's background in biology, biochemistry, and her own experience with radioactive contamination as a young woman have put her in a unique position to speak publicly on radiation policy from a health, safety, and humanitarian perspective. She hopes to inspire cancer prevention strategies worldwide that will contribute to more successful reproduction and viability of future generations. She is no longer with NIRS and now is her own wonderful project, the Gender and Impact, Radiation Impact Project. And so I'm going to turn this with great pleasure over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Molly. Can you hear me? Okay, good. And thank you, Mothers for Peace. And thank you, Beverly and Yuji. Just earlier today, we were commemorating the 10th anniversary. How did 10 years go by? I don't get it, but 10 years since the beginning of Fukushima Daiichi TEPCO nuclear disaster. But it's in deep time. It began then, but it's still going on. And thanking Beverly and Yuji for bearing witness to its continuation. You know, we look at the slides and it's true, you can't see the radiation. And today there's a lot of propaganda, boosterism for reviving nuclear energy once again, calling it clean. And because you can't see the radiation, it's hard for people to grab the fact that it's not clean. And I'm going to start my slides, but I really want to share something that came through to me today, because cognate thinking, right? Tall, short, hot, cold. The cognate with clean is dirty. And I don't think dirty is actually accurate for radiation and radioactivity. I think it's violence. As I go through my slides, consider that radioactivity, the charged particles and waves, actually do violence to the cells of our bodies. And so the cognate pair for this force in our world is peace. We want peace, and there is no peaceful atom once it's been split. So with that thought, I'm going to go ahead and do my slides. I'm going to try to move fairly quickly so we do have time for questions when I'm done. And again, use the chat. I'm not going to be able to blog while I talk, but put your desire to be on the stack in the chat. Okay. I am now with Gender and Radiation Impact Project, and it is genderandradiation.org. Gender and Radiation Impact Project is a project, not a new organization, but it is a nonprofit, and we are very much of a startup looking for collaborative work. Very excited about the project I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. I was saying that I don't have advanced degrees. I started a career in biology, but before I went to graduate school, I myself had a radiation accident in a lab at Yale Medical School where I was a worker. And so I know that this presentation leads people to believe I might be an expert witness or that kind of thing. No, I'm not, but I'm an educator and an advocate. And last year I did manage to get a peer reviewed paper. It is this title, Disproportionate Impact of Radiation and Radiation Regulation. And you can find it on the genderandradiation.org website under resources. The URL says success stories. So we start with this amazing world and the fact that radiation and radioactivity are natural. Yes, they are. They're part of this world. However, we add to that natural background radiation with medical activities, with aviation when we fly high in the atmosphere, with efficient homes that don't let air flow through easily and the buildup of radon. And more than 2,000 detonations of nuclear weapons. This is taken from a short film. It doesn't show the fallout, it shows the ground zeros around our planet where nuclear weapons tests were done and the proportionate numbers of those tests. And then, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which we'll be talking more about. I want to apologize that I've indulged in several slides with text. I don't usually, but I want to make a few points for sure. And this is one. Ionizing radiation is energized particles and waves, and they affect our body at the cellular level. We know that at high levels, this can make immediate sickness and slow death in the form of too many cells killed. At lower levels, including natural radiation, background radiation, the outcomes may be delayed and are both cancer and non-cancer. We're going to go into that. We now have very solid papers showing that the risk from radiation for cancer from exposure is cumulative across our lifetimes. And that pre-birth in the uterus and in childhood, radiation is more potent than in adulthood. And yet I always want to add that our bodies have amazing repair mechanisms, and so not all radiation exposure results in harm. This map was constructed from the iodine exposures from the Nevada test site. At the top, it references milk drinking children. And this was put together clearly county by county, and the red areas are higher levels of dose and exposure. And clearly, this is something that affected a lot of people, and specifically children. This is a map of the reactors worldwide. It's somewhat out of date, but each red dot is a nuclear energy site. And these are the maps constructed soon after the Chernobyl reactor accident, explosion. Arnie will be mad at me that I use the word accident. These aren't accidents. These are events that the engineers know will happen that makes them not an accident. On the left is Europe and the contamination of cesium. On the right is an incomplete map of the contamination in Japan. It doesn't include other areas outside of the immediate zone. And neither of these maps include aquatic contamination, which in the case of the Japanese coast and the Pacific is considerable. So radiation is invisible, but we can see the damage that it has done to these chromosomes. And in this picture, there are genetic material for 3 generations. The outline is the woman, then there's the developing fetus, and that developing fetus has cells that will become ova or spermatogonia, and therefore the genetic material for the next generation, the grandchildren, is present in this picture. So there's non-cancer impacts. I'm just going to run through this very fast, part of it so you can stop the tape and look at it later. But immune function, both reduced and stimulated, are results. Heart muscle damage, infertility, reduced fertility, given a pregnancy, spontaneous abortion, failure of the embryo or fetus, miscarriage later in the term, morphological and other defects which may or may not be heritable, and genetic damage to the next generation, to the ova, to the sperm in the developing fetus or child. And then there's the cancer impacts, all of them: leukemia, lymphoma, tumors, both benign and cancerous. And in pre-birth exposure, cancer can be triggered that results in childhood cancer and childhood leukemia. So this is a simple outline that shows that the energetic particle or wave hits the cell, damages genetic material, although I believe there are other consequences. Epigenetics is beginning to be identified. When the repair mechanisms do not work, a damaged cell may sit and wait and eventually be triggered. Maybe, maybe not. These are all events that we can't predict. We can't predict which exposure will lead to cancer. It is the perfect crime. In general, more radiation means more risk of cancer, but it's Dr. Caldicott's line that it takes only a single living cell and a single radioactive emission to potentially result in fatal cancer. So even doses too small to measure can be harmful. Now, biological sex is a factor in the outcome of radiation exposure. There are now global agencies that acknowledge this. Radiation is harmful to male bodies. Radiation is more harmful to female bodies. This difference is also influenced by age and is as much as a 10-fold difference. These findings are not yet reflected in official safety standards. Why does this matter? Because little girls are not protected by the current safety regulations of the world. And cancer and large things like heart problems have many causes. But when a percentage of those are attributed to radiation, we're underestimating. Radiation regulation based on reference man results in systematic underreporting of radiation harm for the global population. Now, I often end with this slide, but tonight I just had to bring it up sooner. This is a picture of health. These women stopped a nuclear waste dump coming to their ancestral lands. And you can see that they are healthy, that this is not only avoidance of harm, this is empowerment and joy. So what do we have today? In the United States, our primary regulator of commercial nuclear power is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and its regulations state, they say it. I have like 900 documents that say it's based on reference man. And that means that every individual who is being protected by the regulations is assumed to be a reference man. Here's the definition. He's 20 to 30 years old. He weighs 154 pounds. He's 5 feet 7 inches tall. He lives in a climate that's fairly temperate. He's white, and he has a Western European or North American habit or custom, which is part of why our colleagues in traditional lifestyles, Native American Indigenous people, other non-typical industrial society people, they are also not protected, even if they're the same size and shape as a reference man. How is this reference individual used? Well, I've already mentioned that they use it in calculations if they're evaluating exposure from a release or any other types. There's a couple exceptions we can go into, but not right now. In licensing, throughout all the licensing, reference man is used. And in risk assessment, driven by the reference individual. So when a risk is given as 1 in 100,000, they mean 1 reference man in 100,000 reference men. So I just want to for a moment reflect on the fact that there were big, huge workforces that did have some females, but they were mostly males, and they went into remote areas with fences and signs. And in that context, maybe reference man was appropriate. But this webinar is part of a new project to develop a new reference individual. We need a reference girl. All right. This is hard. We will have time to unfold all the reasons that we have only one big data set in the world that has all ages and both sexes, that's publicly accessible. But it's rooted in one of the most devastating and horrific acts that my government ever took, in my view. And I feel so awful about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that to use the data from the survivors makes me cry every time I look at the report or the data directly. And every time I talk about it, I have to acknowledge that this is where the lifespan study comes from. It's from the survivors of that horrific act that happened in 1945. So many people have been influenced and impacted and lost in that decision and what came out of it. That all I can say is that I feel that it tarnishes my soul, and yet I have to continue because of the importance of the finding. It's not an excuse, but it's how I feel about it, that it's that important. So I did not collect the data. The data is all from the A-bomb survivors. It's from the lifespan study that was reported in 2006 by the National Academy of Sciences in a report called The Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, number 7, phase 2. And my own colleague, Diane Dorigo, who's on the call tonight, worked very, very hard to improve the panel that did this report. And much of the world's radiation regulation is based on the data that the NAS and the lifespan study have generated. And that is another reason that I use it, because everybody else uses it. So all of that said, we pretty much knew that radiation is more harmful to children, but there's a shock in the data that the NIS published. And I'm not the only person who looked at it. I'm not the first person who looked at it. Dr. Arjun Makajani and his team at Institute for Energy and Environmental Research wrote a paper in 2006. I simply missed the memo. So in 2011, when I went and looked at this data, I was shocked because it's organized by the age that people were in 1945. They separated male and female. Those groups were tracked over the 60 years in the lifespan study, and cancers were counted, cancer incidence and cancer death. So boys grew up to be men that had cancer, not all of them, but some number of them. The girls who grew up, twice as many of them got cancer as the boys. And as a biologist, I will tell you that this is a stop the music moment when you have a result that's a doubling. And even when the exposure was to adults, there's a major difference. For every 2 men who died of cancer in the lifespan study, 3 women died. I'm going to take a moment to unfold this graph, and then I need a time check to figure out how much more time I have, because I erred. Molly, tell me how much more time I have.
Okay, you have, we can give you about 5 or 10 more minutes, and then hopefully have time for.
Good, I'm about there. That's perfect.
Okay.
So I just told you that age and biological sex have an influence on the outcome of radiation exposure. This flies in the face of everything that you'll hear from the regulators and from a lot of the literature in the nuclear industry, which is that they used to say it this way: a millirem is a millirem. Well, this slide, which is constructed by a colleague of mine, clearly shows that the pink line and the blue line are different. At the bottom is the age people were in 1945 when they were exposed. At the left side is increased risk of cancer from a single exposure. So this is where we've done some dicing and slicing and imagined for a moment that everybody got the same exposure, which they didn't. But when you have a big data set of 100,000 people, this is the kind of thing the epidemiologists do day in and day out. And so it's a what if everybody got the same dose? And that dose at 20 millisieverts is about the same as one CAT scan. So on this graph, females are pink, males are blue. You can see that the pink line is distinct and different the entire way across all the age groups. It never crosses. In every age group, females got more cancer than males. But the difference, as we started with, is biggest in the youngest children. On the left side, that's where that doubling is. I'm going to take for a moment and just look at the pink line. So the largest impacts are to the youngest females, but there's impacts all the way across. Now, the boys too suffer more than does the adult male. So I've put the reference man about where he belongs. When you do the math, I've rounded up, other people round down, I round up, but not much, to say that the outcome for people who were exposed when they were little girls compared to that reference man is 10 times more cancer than was predicted. And as you can see, it's about a 1% increase, which doesn't seem like much, but it's a single exposure. And when you have the whole global population, 1% of the global population, as we see from the pandemic, is a lot of people. So little boys, about 5 times higher than predicted. But the regulator only sees that reference man point on the graph. Females are invisible, and any other aged male is also invisible. So I need to make a major point. The lifespan assumes that it is lifespan study of A-bomb survivors assumes that it is only looking at that gamma flash when the bombs went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. That one flash is the research question for the lifespan study. And that flash is much more similar to the X-ray, medical X-ray, which is the image on the left, than it is to the image on the right, taken by Robert Del Tredici as a photograph of plutonium in the lung. And all the black in that slide is dead cells from the very close radiation of the internalized radioactivity that's then continuing to emit inside the human body. Actually, this is an ape. So much closer to the Chernobyl, Hanford, Fukushima on the right side. Both, people get both, but we don't know if what I've told you just now applies to internal exposure. That's a question that hasn't been asked or answered. So I'm going to skip some of this. It has to do with we should have a life cycle that looks more like that because the differences are so great. We should understand that the female has its own somatic phase. But we want to move into talking a little bit about reference girl as I wrap up. It's only a first step. We need so much more radiation revision, revising of radiation standards than reference girl. It's a first step. But we want to engage in a process to invite input on what the parameters of a reference girl would be. How old is she? What is her weight? What's her height? What's her climate? Does race matter? If so, what is it? Culture, habits, and customs clearly matter. What else matters? We want to put together a discussion of this and come up with a draft and do some expert review of that draft, and then march her out with hopefully a whole posse to support her as a new proposal. And this is not a reference for girls. We want to propose her to be the new reference for everyone. So when a risk factor is given, it is for a reference girl, 1 in 100,000 reference girls. This will protect men and boys better, and we're happy about that. And it will protect girls at all. So just a quick run through on why. my teacher, Dr. Rosalie Bertel, is the one who sent me to the lifespan study. Her theory was that it has to do with more reproductive tissue in the female body. Other people have suggested that it has to do with a percentage of fat tissue. These are all the research questions. I'm going to skip to cell maturation or cell repair mechanisms. Is there a difference between males and females in that? And we now have a researcher who is proposing that it has to do with stem cell population. And that's very interesting. And we could unravel that at another moment. But we also need to ask and answer whether internal exposure also has a gender factor. And that is so important to know and understand for people living in contaminated areas. And finally, we need big research institutions to get involved. We need a new generation of researchers. It's not one field. It's not all left to health physics. It's epidemiology, cell biology, field ecology. Get big data involved, but they're not the same as a real data set with case control. And we need the epidemiologists to do that. And we need assessment of the practices in medicine. And finally, we need a whole lot of peer-reviewed publications to underpin a new policy debate. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mary. A lot of information that you compacted in there. Thank you so much. So Jane and
Linda.
Celia, yeah. You want to take over here? And I see that we have a lot of comments.
You know, the chat has been really quiet because Mary was so mesmerizing.
Yes, I agree.
We will provide the recording for people.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's being recorded. It'll be posted on lots of places. Mothers for Peace will put it on YouTube and then put it on our site. Okay, great.
I have a question for you, Mary. Could you possibly talk about the beer study and why it was stopped?
So I think maybe you're talking about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission commissioning the National Academy of Sciences to do a review of communities sort of as a phase 1, and then maybe they were going to go to a phase 2 of a study of health effects. And you know, there's so many views on this, and I have no inside line, but suffice it to say, there was a lot of interest in getting a study at all. And I understand that, but I also know that it's a very, very complicated situation when you have the perpetrator, excuse me, but these are nuclear facilities and these are communities around those nuclear facilities. And it's the regulator who licenses those facilities saying, let's do this study and paying for it. So that was a shocker that they were even willing to subject their own regulations to an examination of their effectiveness, of their protectiveness, of the outcome. I mean, that it shocked me that they would do that. But it's also really not the basis for science. If they had put up a bunch of money and given it to National Science Foundation or the National Environmental Health Institute, which also gives out grants on a competitive basis, if those bodies had put an independent RFP, request for proposal, and then scientists who could come in independently and study these communities, that would have had some credibility. So on the one hand, it was shocking that they canceled it. On the other hand, it was shocking that they did it at all. And on the third hand, there's now a revived interest in terms of Congress and potentially a number of bodies who are not, in my view, any better than the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Like, why would you turn to the DOE, which is what I see happening? I don't know. It's a very complicated thing. The one thing I can say is that if we get a few more studies, that red and blue graph can be used by anyone to say there could be a problem here and
We have
not
a,
have to replicate it, not have to have a new study.
there's a question right here, Mary, that I don't think you saw, from Tina Cordova. She said, in New Mexico, there were 10 pounds of plutonium that didn't fission and that was spread all across our state. Imagine the harm to our children. Our infant mortality rates more than doubled in the months just after Trinity. It is no wonder. It would be amazing to ask if more little girls died than little boys. Do you have any comment?
I sincerely hope there are records that can be accessed to answer that question. So the Trinity test certainly resulted in the same type of external exposure that happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So there's that piece, but the scattering of the unfissioned plutonium, the exposure would primarily be through inhaling it in the air as dust and eating it and drinking it. And therefore internal exposures were very dangerous. And I'm very, very concerned about the impacts from that. As a finer point, the male versus female difference, we just haven't documented for internal exposure. It doesn't mean it isn't there. It just means there's no data to support an answer to that question. But in New Mexico, we should look and see.
Yeah, Mary, there's another question in the chat. I'll read it. Can you comment on the legitimacy of the Hiroshima survivor study? Many say it is totally suspect, heavily biased, did not even start until 1950.
I did not have time tonight to include my own list of all the things that are wrong with the data from the RERF and the lifespan study both. There are many, many problems with it. And I think we should be chewing it up and shaking it out and looking at them and understanding what they are and how they change our views. The fact that it began in 1950 actually plays into the research question, which is what is for the lifespan study. The lifespan study's research question, which is not the same as trying to help people who are survivors to understand their own health consequences. Believe me, I don't feel good about treating people, survivors, victims, as data, but that's what this is a data set when we're talking about the lifespan study. And the research question, that brutal reduction of a human experience into a scientific query, would want to exclude the first 5 years of death so that the long-term consequences are what's in the data set. Now this skews that data set. It means the people who are most affected by radiation were not in the group that was studied. And so we call that the healthy worker effect in nuclear worker populations and the robust survivor effect in the case of the Japanese A-bomb survivors. And you know, it just disgusts me, the whole matter of a war crime. I mean, the war, I mean, the whole thing just disgusts me so incredibly. I spent 2 months crying when Rosalie Bertell told me I should go look at the Beer 7 data because I didn't want to. I didn't want to engage at this level, but this is the level that is engaged. And because it is engaged, because the International Committee for Radiological Protection, because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because the EPA all use this same data to find this pattern in that data set makes it pretty damned irrefutable. So forgive me, I go there and I hate that I go there. It is not about individuals. It is not about their suffering, and it is not about truth about any one individual. But to talk about cancer, you have to go into these large numbers because nobody can say which cancer is caused by what. And so we're talking about excesses, and that's where that pink line and blue line come in. And the only thing I'm going to say now before I stop and acknowledge that I am pissed with the whole picture is that so many people are asking to be studied. So many people are asking for more for their data to be included in further understanding, that we have to kind of reconcile the rightness and the wrongness with also the need. And there is no other large group that isn't atomic workers who have been primarily male and certainly all adults. So you can't talk about age-related outcomes by going to the atomic workers, which is where Alice Stewart was working towards the end of her life, and other very renowned research, but it's all on adults.
Mary, several people are asking if your slides are available on your website or elsewhere.
I'd be glad to, yes, I will post these as a PDF, and if somebody wants to contact me, they're too big to email. So we have to figure out a file transfer, but I'm glad to share them.
Okay. Good. Let's see. There are a lot of comments in the chat. So people who are interested, please save the chat. I'm reminding you. I save it at the very end so you get all of it. I'll read a comment here. It's not really a question, it's a comment.
Some people, real quick, some people may not know how you go to the bottom place where it says file and press on that little thing next to it. And that's where you can save
There's
the
a little thing that says chat. Well, it's, for me, it says chat. And then you'll see spaces there.
Yes, and Jane, for some reason, I show up as Mary Olson on
Yeah.
the screen. I'm the second Mary Olson. And someone's, Erica Gray sent a direct message, and it shows up on my chat. Is there data publicly available showing cancer rates near nuclear power plants?
Basically, this is a sad and sorry tale of our elected officials working for our utility and weapons contractors instead of the people, right? Because there was one study done when I started 30 years ago in this field. There was one study out there by the National Cancer Institute, and it looked at the county the reactor was in. And many of us know that reactors are sited so that they're right near the border of the county, or right near the border of the state, or right on the river, or right near the water because they need cooling water. Lots of reasons, but downwind and downwater people weren't always included in the National Cancer Institute study that showed no correlation. The one thing that happened after that that did show correlation was a study of the Pilgrim reactor by the Massachusetts Department of Health. And there's certainly been a lot of studies in Europe, especially post-Chernobyl, that show correlations between health consequences in reactors. I'm sure we could all start pooling various papers in the United States. I'm not going to say there's been zero. Steve Wing did a reanalysis of the 3 Mile Island accident. The data was collected by people previous to him, but he did an independent analysis like I did of the Beer 7 data that showed lots of consequences from that accident that were denied officially. So basically it's like this and like this and like this.
Yeah. I'll read a question that relates to what you were just talking about from Diane Dorigo. She says, can you talk about the lack of a control group once Japan started sending Fukushima contaminated waste to incinerators across the whole country to be burned?
Thank you, Diane. That's really been bugging me too, the part about the incineration. The picture that Beverly and Yuji showed is a showcase right near the museum, right in Fukushima Prefecture. But right after the tsunami, there was so much mud and debris, and it was sold as a service to the suffering victims of Fukushima Prefecture and Sendai, the city that was decimated, to take that debris into municipal incinerators nationwide. And not all of it was radioactively contaminated, but a lot of it was. And it did not have the level of technology that we saw in that picture. And so there's a strong feeling that some of the highly radioactive particles that have been found outside of the immediate area of the accident may have gotten there through debris being shipped and then incinerated in municipal garbage incinerators without the proper filters, and basically spraying it all around Japan. Now, I have to acknowledge that Diane cast that question in terms of a control group. To any information that I have, nobody is creating a data set from Fukushima impacted people. Maybe it's happening, but I haven't heard about it.
Mary, thank you. We have another question from Kathy Iwane. She says she's wondering if you've had barriers to obtaining data or research of cancer clusters in the US as it relates to female infants, women, and children. If so, can you postulate why? If you've been able to compile data in the US on ionizing radiation on women versus men, female versus male, children, infants, can you share what you've learned? I'm especially interested in data on populations near nuclear power plants, which are online, and nuclear waste storage facilities.
Kathy, that's a beautiful question, and I hope you will keep it and literally copy that out and maintain that question. That and so many other active questions need to have a life. I got into all this because a woman asked me a question after a radioactive waste talk that I gave in like 2009. She wanted to know, was radiation more harmful to her than to a man? And I gave her a pregnancy answer. And she came back and she said, no, I wasn't talking about pregnancy. I wanted to know about me. And all I can get is that maybe she'd heard rumors from Arjun Makajani's paper or some other source, but I'd never heard, ever, that biological sex was a factor. I was friends with some of the top researchers of the 20th century. Male versus female was just not a thing. And so I forgot the question. I mean, I gave her a nice little, oh, I'll get back to you when I have looked up the answer. And I did do some Google searches. I didn't turn up Arjun's paper. And I promptly forgot the question because it was so overwhelming to me. So it was when I saw the Mark I reactors in Japan blowing up. Days from now are the anniversaries of those horrific explosions in TEPCO's Daiichi, that the question flooded back. So me, I'm a zero fund, well, not quite zero. I have wonderful gifts from a few people. Mothers for Peace made a generous gift, but no funding for Gender and Radiation Impact Project to be anything but a volunteer effort. So my goal is to activate young women and men who are getting their PhDs, who are getting their MDs, who are teaching people who are getting those degrees, because this has to become a major research endeavor, because we're talking about half of the people on the planet. We're talking about every X-ray, every dental X-ray. We're talking about radon in the home. We're talking about aviation. We're talking about living near a reactor. We're talking about the fallout from all the nuclear weapons. We're talking about all of it. And so it can't be a little question. It has to become a very big question. So my job is to keep the question, and yours is a beautifully well articulated form of the question. So please keep it alive. But I am not doing any further research. I'm 62 years old, I'm retired, I'm living on Social Security, and I just don't have what it takes to do that. So help me find people who do, because that is what we need.
Kyoko Sato, you put a really long, wonderful thingy in the chat. Would you like to unmute and speak to it? If not, I'll read what you wrote, but I think you
Oh,
like.
no. I can't talk as well. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. I wish you included the slides about the limitations of ABCC studies, because they're quite a list, I think. And still, because of its size and the length, it's such a considered a building block for all the international radiation protection standards. And then also that fact that it's done by basically Americans, and then all these political nature despite that, these standards are treated as if these are this kind of objective standards. So they're already quite, what's the opposite of conservative in terms of the calculation of risks. And then just 2 days ago, Unscare declared that they're going to support their 2013 report that basically says that Fukushima didn't cause any substantial health effects. And then there was this lawsuit that was filed in 2014, basically saying that the government has a responsibility to protect children from radiation exposure, and that just ended 10 days ago, March 1st, in favor of the government, and the ruling constantly refers to according to ICRP standards. So there was this like crazy cycle of like reaffirming this idea that these standards are normal. How do we get out of it? Because there have been so many critiques. You mentioned I stored, and yet there's always this, well, this is the best we got. So how do we get out of that? Thank you.
I hear you. And I agree with absolutely everything you said and everything you were thinking that you didn't say, because these are long and thorny conversations and they're so important. So believe me, I'm right there with you. As a co-critic, shall I say, I have alienated a couple of friends by my decision to go ahead and use Beer 7. But politically, strategically, and quite frankly, in terms of feminism, it is a strategic thing to find this pattern of this difference between males and females and children and adults in the very thing that they claim to use for their reference man. It's all there. They've just been ignoring it. So in a certain way, as the opening, it's not the end, it's just the first step. As the opening of a new discourse with these same people, I find value in common ground. When you're a negotiator, if you can come in and say, oh, you like Super Bowl and eating pizza? I like Super Bowl and eating pizza. Let's have Super Bowl and eat pizza together. I mean, it's sort of this weird thing about negotiating with people. If you can find a common ground, you can go further. So I happen to have a reason to believe that once we have our draft reference girl, there's a number of younger people who are now sitting on official bodies, including ICRP and Unscare, who are willing to bring her. They've told me they're willing to bring her. So I want to create a credible process, a defensible process, an inclusive process to come up with this proposal, knowing it's only a first step. It's not adequate. It only creates the conversation. But it's a conversation that's for something. And after 30 years of only fighting against things, of only boycotting, of only not saying that's not good enough, I won't talk to you, I am so overjoyed to have a new treaty on nuclear weapons that prohibits them, that I can support, and the concept of a reference girl that I can say is not good enough, but is a good start, and be promoting something that people could get behind, and then push in all the ways that you're suggesting. Because I want to make one last point, and I know we need to stop and close, but it's all liability. That's what's at work here. The people who have liability want to cover their tushies, right? And the people who have to pay for the liability are more interested. And so nations that have socialized medicine, who have to pay for the costs of the increased cancer, are far more interested in this conversation than nations like the one I live in, where they profit from the illness. So ultimately, it comes down to human nature, to our ability to transcend these petty ideas that profit is the motive, right? It's not profit that's the motive, it's blame and liability in covering their tushies. So if we can come positively saying, we want to protect you better, our reference girl will give a man 10 times more protection. Isn't that a good thing? So the people who are going to support that are the people who are paying for the disease, not the people who are causing the disease. But when I saw my colleagues going out and talking about trying to get radiation risk to the 1 in 100,000 level, which is where the toxics are, but using reference man, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission allows as their starting point a risk of 1 fatal cancer in every 286 reference men. 1 in 286. And so colleagues were going out and talking about getting it to 1 in 100,000. I realized when I saw these numbers on males versus females, that if we adopted reference girl, we'd be shutting them down. We would totally be shutting them down. So I don't say that very often, but I'll tell you here tonight, that's why I'm doing this.
All right, thank you, Mary. And then I think Mary does have an announcement before we close,
Oh,
right? About
yeah.
your, yes.
We're going to be opening consultation with anybody who wants to consult on who is reference girl. Help us determine who is reference girl. And so I'm going to invite you to go to genderandradiation.org, genderandradiation.org, and go to the contact us. Now there's a form, you can do that if you want to, but there's just a little slot for your email to get on our newsletter, which is no money, just sign up. It sends you a message, you have to press a link and say, yes, I want to get on that newsletter. But that will be your way to hear about consultations or invite us to set up one. If you want to have a group participate, that's great. If you want to do it individually. But we're going to spend probably 4 to 6 months doing consultations and want to do it in 2021. So go there and sign up, and we welcome everybody who wants to get in.
Thank you so much to our presenters. Just absolutely wonderful for all of the questions. You know, I feel like we need to just keep going for another hour or so, but I know we all aren't ready to do that. So thank you so much for joining us. You can say chat. There's those 3 little dots below in the chat that you can save your chat. And then also this has been recorded, so this will be available. And thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.